question that I'm often asking, are we really going through a crisis? Or is the crisis a sleepwalking through the cavities of our trauma absence? Is there really something like a crisis? Or does crisis always ring the bell and say, humanity look like the plagues in Egypt in the Bible? Is it really that the plagues create the crisis? Or does it show us where information cannot flow in us, where we are absent, where we are hitting these black holes, but we are actually not stopping, saying, listen, what are all those symptoms? What is all this chaos, all this miscommunication? What is all this inability to take care of a pandemic?
Welcome back to Integral Voices, convened and produced by the Center for Transformative Learning at Meridian University. I'm Aftab Omer, and I'm glad to be in conversation with Thomas Hubl for today's episode, Listening to the Voice of the Field, the Great Conductor, and the Black Hole. Integral Voices is a video and audio podcast available on all podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as YouTube. To stay updated on upcoming episodes and to explore the archive, visit meridianuniversity.edu/Integral Voices. Now to my conversation with Thomas Hubl. Hello, Thomas. It's good to see you, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Transformative Learning at Meridian University.
Oh, thank you, Aftab. I'm so happy to be here and to be here with you, especially. Mm-hmm.
I'm remembering in this moment that our very first conversation that we had in 2012 was on collective trauma. In fact, I got to know about you the year prior because of your work on collective trauma. So I'm glad to be having yet another conversation on this topic with you and continue the conversation we had just a few weeks ago as well.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
And here we are in the middle of the pandemic on April 26th, 2020. You're in Tel Aviv. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, about an hour north of San Francisco. What is present in your context in Tel Aviv?
Well, I think, first of all, it's to feel that in a way, Israel is a country that experienced multiple wars, and that a kind of more strict set of rules has been applied very early on, which, and I mean, usually the fact that it's hard to cross any kind of border here is a difficult situation. Right now, it turns out to be, for the given pandemic, a good situation because it's actually very hard to get into Israel besides the airport, which is almost locked down. So there's very little there are very little opportunities to bring the virus here to Israel. So this made it kind of a more kind of contained crisis in the country. And as I said, I think the fact that the whole nation is very used to crisis situations, the response to it is kind of very organized and very strict and straightforward. It's like kind of a bit of an army command. And at the same time, I believe it's also like when we talk about collective trauma, we talk about current situations that are happening right now and how to strengthen or make or activate the resiliency in the population. But then we're also talking about collective trauma that is kind of a transgenerational collective trauma that happened some generations ago. And we see the reactivation as here as well as in Europe or in other places around the world when there is a new collective stress or crisis situation. It activates the collective trauma field that is kind of in the collective subconscious and it's waiting to be triggered. So I think we see that too. Since I talked to one lady here that said, yeah, this is not Auschwitz. It was a kind of an interesting sentence. Like I mean, it's very clear and obvious on the one hand, but it's also an interesting sentence how we take it as normal that we see the past reflected in the now very often. And it seems that that's a natural phenomenon that is normal in life. And I love to speak, and maybe we will explore this too here now, like what has been normal is the hurt world that we have been born in is normally hurt. And I think that that's an interesting place to explore collective trauma from, that it's so normal to us that we can't see it easily. Because the part that we see is more obvious, but the more interesting part is the part that we don't see. Yeah.
Israel is bringing some of its collective capabilities to bear on this challenge, as well as collective habits that are not optimal. In a way, the US is somewhat at the other end of a certain axis here. We might say the axis of a centralized response versus a decentralized response. You're likely aware that at the very top of the US government, there is a lack of alignment, a lack of coherence about how science is a part of how we need to respond, and how there are federal responses needed, and how those federal responses are to interlock in useful ways with regional responses. That whole fulcrum that should be working optimally has not been doing so. So that we're able to see where the collective capabilities of the US and the collective blind spots, the collective limitations have showed up. We've been fortunate in California because the governance in California recognized the need for a lockdown, was the first in 50 some states to recognize that. And in a number of other ways, the California itself is maybe 30 million people. It's the seventh largest economy in the world. So it's almost like its own country. But our experience in California is quite different than other parts of the US. And I'm glad that this dynamic between collective trauma and collective capability has emerged early in our conversation. I imagine we might circle around this some. So I'm curious, Thomas, we haven't talked about this before. At some point in your own journey, your own journey in science, your journey in mystical understanding, this topic emerged. And I'm curious when that happened and what some of the biographical and cultural collective, the biographical and collective context for that.
So first of all, I think when I came out of my 4 to 5 year meditation retreat time, I started to teach pretty quickly, and my groups grew pretty quickly, and that happened mostly in Europe and in the German-speaking part of Europe at the beginning. So many groups happened in Germany, and around pretty, this was not such a long time, 1 or 2 years in, I already encountered like my first, what I would call now like collective trauma process, that there was this, at the beginning, like we did, in our groups, we work a lot on relational data streaming, I call it today. What is present relation, and what's really happening right now, and what are all the aspects of human relation that are informed by the past, and not by the past by what we learned yesterday, but by the unintegrated past that creates kind of interferences, like you said before, in the culture. The unconscious spots or the absent spots in the culture are creating relational or cultural interferences with the intelligence that we can express. And so I looked at there was the group, and we, like through our work, we do a lot of coherence building, relational coherence building, and from a certain level of group safety and group coherence, that's how I talk about it today. At that time, there simply on day 3 or 4, suddenly there was a moment when the whole group felt so heavy and tiring, and it was like you want to just go out of the room and say, what am I doing here? Why are we doing groups at all? So a lot of internal symptoms of resistance came up, or numbness. And then just by presencing that and staying with it, there was a kind of eruption of Second World War Holocaust content and information from the subconscious. And many people experienced this, like at once 50 people started to cry in a room of, I don't know, more people. And also see inner visions. Like it was very clearly an eruption of collective unconscious material that came up through a pipe of a group that was coherent and safe enough that the nervous systems could allow this information to surface. And so that was the first time, and then it took us the rest of the workshop, 2, 3, 4 days, to integrate that experience and land the group in a good place. But the thing was then that I thought, okay, that's a one-time experience, but then it started to happen almost in every group, the same process. And it's not that we intentionally induced it, it kind of came up on its own. And then that's what brought me to study that deeper and learn about it. And I think by now it's kind of 15 or 17 years later. We did many of them. And so by now I have a much deeper understanding of what's happening there. How can it be modulated? How can it be run, facilitated? And so we applied this then not only in the German-speaking part of the world, but in different parts of the world, and looked at collective scars. And basically, one of the most striking experiences is that when this heavy numbness comes into the room. So many people, it's not just that one person feels like this, like almost the whole group feels like that. And it's so clear that we meet the end of the conscious universe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's fascinating. It's like as if you can really see a signpost in the room. Here, the conscious world ends. Because it's like almost a palpable barrier that here the darkness or the underworld, or there are many ways how we as human beings in human history describe that, but you can see the entrance to the underworld in the room. And I found that fascinating, that how that entrance to the underworld, or that end of the conscious world, lives 24/7 in us, in our nervous systems. We just don't put the spotlight of consciousness there. It's like there's a huge spotlight, and when it's been pointed at that end, that we see the end of the world, like the end of the conscious world, sits here amongst us all the time. And then we call it, oh, we are failing to respond to the pandemic crisis in the most intelligent way. And I find this fascinating. Where do we look for the darkness when it sits amongst us and we are looking for it somewhere? And so this is just one of the learnings, like how that lives in us all the time. It doesn't matter if it's called the collective shadow of slavery or the Native American genocide, the Holocaust, other genocides, war trauma around the world. I mean, there are so many. Yeah, so that's how it started, basically.
Some parallel experience here with for me and my colleagues. In the 90s, in doing some group work, we began to speak about the appearance of the black hole. And so I was reminded of this as you were speaking. Right. And part of what we noticed is that when the black hole appears or arises in the group, one, at least initially, until one's eyes have learned to see it, the black hole arises and no one knows that it is here. Mm-hmm. Except that we are in it and being sucked into it. And everything that is said goes nowhere. No one responds to anything that's said by anybody because it's all going into the black hole.
Beautiful.
And I'm remembering the first group in 1995 that first became aware of the black hole and could come back. These were 7-day residencies. So could come back the next day and actually make the topic of inquiry, what happened yesterday? Mm-hmm. And then your emphasis where you began with is that this absence is a good term for this absence, which is not presence, but it is real. And we have to bring presence to this absence. And that's part of the practitioner capabilities that are important in how we educate collective trauma practitioners. Practitioners who can activate collective intelligence and presence collective wisdom in the midst of the chaos.
That's right. Beautiful. And that are willing to feel what cannot be felt at the beginning and stay, like are willing to go into the strong. And that's, I think, the challenge that we are learning. And that's where the mystical knowledge is so important, or the transpersonal knowledge. Because if I'm identified fully with my own personality or personal experience, it's very hard to make real space for you because most of the things I see is me. So then practitioners learn to make more space for their clients and be in an authentic relation with themselves and their clients. But now we are like enlarging the game board extremely, and we are saying, wow, we are actually walking into the jungle of collective forces. Like these are, and when, you know, in the Far East, when people use the word karma, it sounds like a bit innocent, but you said something very beautiful. You said, this is not present, but it's real. And karma is not this, oh, I also have some karma. Karma means murdering people in concentration camps. Karma means torturing people, burning witches, like waging wars. Like karma is very concrete. This is stuff that really happened, that was really painful. It's a very real thing that was so overwhelming that it's still very real, but without our presence. And I think if we bring this more to our attention, that when we talk about ethics, when we talk about the development of our cultures, when we talk about our personal development or collective development, we actually are up for a big task, which is the correction of our transgressions of the law of life. And I think that's a very powerful, the ultimate trauma healing is the restoration of the law of life, that light can, a conscious awareness can flow through our bodies, through our nervous system, through our organs, through our cells, through our behavior and actions. And that needs a lot of, like, going into this black hole needs a lot of skill, needs a lot of energetic awareness, needs a lot of willingness to feel uncomfortable, needs a lot of presence and grounding and pre-integration of our personal stuff. So that's a pretty complex, that people want to explore and come back the next day is not that given. You know, you need to have already courage to be in a certain amount of discomfort, to be in this presence consciously of the black hole, as you framed it, and to keep exploring within it, because many people say, what am I doing here? Why would I voluntarily sign up to feel so uncomfortable, you know, with people in the room? So what I'm saying is, it needs a certain skill set and equipment to go to, like in the mythological, as you know better than I do, like the going into the underworld. The hero's journey is literally a journey into the dark underworld. And I think since the dark is not out there, but now we explore it to be here, it's a very interesting journey. I find a very exciting journey. But it's not a comfortable journey. That's also important to say.
There's a opportunity here for a collective creative surrender in terms of alignment with life. In one of these black hole experiences in the 90s, this was in about a group of 30 people, so not the much larger groups that you've been working with. We were in this black hole landscape, mindscape, and I had the impulse to say to the group, let's just go down to our knees. We were sitting, and some people were standing kind of at the edges in these somewhat dissociated, disembodied black hole spaces. And so what is interesting is that everyone quickly went onto their knees, except one person. And how the journey of that person unfolded over the next few years seems to be connected with this event. And when you first began to speak about karma some moments ago, I was reminded of something that Freud once said. He said, "Wherever I go, I note that an artist's footsteps have been there before me." And so this brings up a question. Your work in mystical practice, mystical understanding, is it prior to your work with collective trauma, or are they coextensive?
No, it was prior to and I think it gave me part of the capacities or skill sets to encounter collective trauma. It just didn't happen to me. It's related to my prior practice to be able to be attuned to, perceptive enough, and able to presence and be with a group in a space that is like a storm. It's like standing in a storm. It's a really strong event. And I believe that this like long meditation time and the kind of training that I went through there is also part of became that work with collective trauma, because in my understanding so far, like the transpersonal, the collective, and the individual work are all needed in order to stand consciously within that complexity. Otherwise, it's very easy to mix personal experiences, collective experiences, and transpersonal experiences into one pot and create a big soup. And to be able to stay in a level of discernment, because I found out that it's very important in these collective trauma processes to, when then many people in these larger groups share their experience, that everybody speaks a different text and a different concentration of the collective topic in their text. So some texts, they are very like the small printed text, and some text, which means some of the sharings actually express a very concentrated energy of the collective trauma that is in the room right now. So some people speak more about their personal experience right now, and it's truly a personal voice. And then some people, it sounds like a personal voice, but they actually speak a collective voice that is plugged into a high-level power plant. And if we synchronize the whole group's field attention to that sentence, so often I say one sentence: they couldn't come home. And if we connect it to the kind of right group coherence, then it goes like, it's like a fire in the room. And if it's, because often what's being the word and the energy is not fully coherent, but if you give it a space to become coherent with the group awareness, then it has actually a collective healing capacity. And those concentrated voices need to be discerned, because if it's put too much energy on the individual voices and experiences, the process is way less effective than when we highlight with a marker the text in the book where the most important sentences, when you go through a book and you study it, and then you highlight a few sentences that are key sentences of the teaching. And every collective trauma process the same, is reading in the book of life and opening up the past, but the past is the unintegrated history that we are walking into. So we're actually walking in the past of humanity, bringing it back, like releasing it out of its prison in space-time. Mm-hmm. And that's very powerful. Like, go to the past to release the prisoner, to bring it back into a coherence with now. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it will come up as symptoms all the time in individuals and the culture. Right.
I'm continuing to imagine what you're saying in relation to the metaphor of the black hole.
Mhm.
The black hole has its intense gravitational force, so that the presence of the past can suck us into this black hole vortex, and then generating a counter force, or a, maybe force is not the right word, but something that counters it, so that it becomes possible and creative for us to be able to, in a sense, walk around the boundary of the black hole. So there's some complexity here. There's the black hole of absence. However, it is full as well of the past and its suffering. Many people, including many scientists of various backgrounds, might have, social scientists, for example, might have walked by the black hole as it emerged in this gathering you were referencing for the first time. However, you began to walk around it and began to learn about it in a scientific way. So, in the last 20 years, there has been, as you're very well aware, and you are connected with many of these scientists, practitioners. So we have this watershed of new understanding about trauma. And the deeper it went, the more the collective nature of trauma was illuminated. And that when we are working with individuals, we are also working with collective trauma that we cannot make sense. So now we have a body of knowledge that practitioners who see themselves as trauma practitioners or even collective trauma practitioners have to bring to bear on the current difficulties and challenges that are here on a planetary level. Your journey is distinct because, and very rare to my knowledge, where mystical understanding, mystical practice is coming into relationship with scientific inquiry. That presents some new possibilities for how trauma practitioners and collective trauma practitioners, with or without professional credentials, are educated. What I know that working with fields, from our conversation a few weeks ago, we talked about social fields, relational fields, sometimes referred to as interactive fields or intersubjective fields. What have you been learning most recently about fields, and where are your questions?
Beautiful. Yeah, so first of all, what I am very inspired by is the relation between, like, there, I will throw into the mix, I will bring up some words first. Like, one is field thinking. What's the difference between thinking about and thinking as? Like, how can I think you as a field instead of thinking about Aftab? So what is when And that's one of the mystical practices, is the deep alignment or inner coherence in the nervous system between the thinking and the feeling, or the mind and the heart. So that's not two in the fragmentation of the trauma that we see so often, as is also a pandemic, or that we see a coherence, and that thinking and feeling, or the word and the action, the word and the energy, are not two. So we are entering into the field through coherence. Coherence opens the gate into the field, and fragmentation opens the gate into separation or isolation. Or so when, in order to be able to work on fields, I need to come through what we call the resource parts of our nervous system. I need to come through the integrated parts of myself. And that's how I get access through different parts of myself, through two different aspects of the field, which is all of us and much more. Like nobody is outside and comes into the field, even if we feel separate from it. We are still in it. So there's no, like, maturity is the conscious experience of interdependence, which is like that I individualized, but I experience myself as an interconnected part of the whole. And so that's one thing, that field thinking is the next, in my understanding, the next level of thinking. It's not I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking it. Like not it's it and me is interdependent. So it's kind of a comprehension that is intimate. It's an intimate understanding, not a separate understanding. And it's also not fused, like in that I couldn't make like a distinction between outside and inside in the early parts of my life. It's a trance state. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is that, and I come back, I weave it all together into the field, because the other part is that the black hole is like, where is actually the force, like in the mystical understanding, the right and the left hand of God are God. The dark and the light are God's creation, not only the light. And that means the black hole, where is actually the will into my left hand? So how do we create collectively, or how does the trauma fragmentation, where is the decision to fragment? Or which will splits it off? And so when we look at social absencing, as Otto Scharmer puts it, the social absencing is not that there's absencing, it's like absencing is a process of fragmenting and staying absent. In my groups, I often ask people, so what's your fridge doing right now? And then, and then people say, yeah, keeping my food cool or freezing my food. And say, who pays the bill? Yeah, me. Say, right? So that's the same for your trauma too. Like, it's not that it happened and then ever since it, you don't pay for it. It's kind of, we are paying life energy moment to moment to moment for keeping it frozen. And that's true for the Holocaust that I said before. To put the end of the world here takes a huge effort. And that energy is bound as a prisoner of time, 1944, 1943, 1942. And there are huge amounts of energy going into fragmenting. And so, like, that energy is bound in time as a hostage, where we need it in order to take care of a pandemic. So how do we actually, in the collective body, get access to the darkness is not the pathology, the darkness is actually the hidden will that creates it. And the dark will or the hidden will, that's an interesting exploration, because once in Nepal, I brought a group to groups to the Himalayas for meditation retreats. And once a prayer came to me, and one line of the prayer is, and I'm grateful for what I see, and I'm grateful for what stays hidden, because this is thy will, and that's why I'm here. Because the spiritual ego might think, the more I see, the better, which means I don't respect the intelligence in the dissociation. And so in the moment I respect that if something stays hidden, and that's also the Western consumerism that ends up in many psychedelic induced experiences, that I think because I can buy it, I'm entitled to have it. When actually God says, if you're not having it, you're not entitled to it because you're not ready for it. So speeding up our spiritual evolution is actually stealing light, and not really, because the sensational experience is more valid than the ethical restoration that allows us to have it. And so that's an interesting question. What does it mean? I'm grateful, I bow to what I see, and I bow to what I don't see, because what I don't see has a good reason not to be seen. So that the fact that we encountered again and again the end of the world, the conscious world, or what you said, you encountered the black hole. Yeah, but the black hole means that thousands of employees in companies in the Silicon Valley are not flooded by enormous content and pain that would not make them be able to do their work on, I don't know, the latest technology, because their systems would be flooded by all kinds of unconscious content, slavery and the Native American genocide and other stuff produced. And so, and what I'm saying is, in the work with fields mean that as a facilitator, I need a high level precision, moment to moment to moment, to be in sync with, or synchronized with, the online data streaming, even if streaming is almost impossible. And I love this precision when we walk into the jungle of that kind of collective field. It needs a high level of awareness. And I believe that's when you see Shaolin monks, or when you see high-level spiritual practitioners, there is something about the alignment and the energy that is so in tune with what happens right now in the present moment, that it almost seems seamless, or it seems seamless. It doesn't create extra noise. And that, I think, is a very important aspect of working with fields, because it means that we are deeply dialed into those fields. For example, recently we did this collective trauma process between East and West Europe. Like, we looked at the fragmentation between East and West Germany and East and West Europe. And just by putting we had the people from the West sit on one side, East on the other. And then we put symbolically a few bricks in the middle, and there was this huge wave of, and many people started to cry, and people that even didn't feel closely related to it felt strong emotions come up. And that's a practical example of the field work. But I believe what it needs is also a field attunement that is needed also, because without that attunement, we can also put bricks and not so much is happening. So I think that all the elements together, this field thinking, that my cognition and my field awareness become one. So I actually become a voice or a part of the field consciously. And that's very exciting, I think, as the new skill set that we develop for the next level of collective healing capacity, or collective integration work, or collective learning, as I think you explore also.
There is a beautiful ancient Greek word, aletheia. And it could be in this context translated as an unconcealing that coheres. Unconcealing that coheres. We could even think of Aletheia as the voice of the field. Speaking, the voice of the field speaking through each of us as we are involved in what you call field thinking. Is the field speaking through me? Is it able to speak through me? Are we collectively aware of when we are surfing the field or trying to over-direct it in some triumphant way? I'm reminded of the film, The Triumph of the Will, which has so many images from the Nuremberg rallies. And something's happening there in that field. And then we can see, if we saw film of, there are some concerts that happen in South Africa around the time when apartheid was unraveling, which have a very different kind of collective presence in it. So this sensitivity to fields, field awareness, and how we come into relationship with the relational field is where our conversation seems to be going.
Right. That's right. That's also where I often call it the cloud computing. This when I tune in with you and you tune in with me, we create a synchronized field between us, between our nervous systems, our perception. When we do the same with groups, so we create actually a very strong group coherence just by precise attunement that is embodied, that uses the body, the emotions, the mind, of course, and presence, relation. And that we tune in, I feel you feeling me, that we tune in with the attunement too. And so there is a coherence building function. And I believe the more precise we are dialed into that cloud computing that happens through us, that also I have seen many times that the more present and coherent groups are, the individual within the group, every individual, is invited into a higher probability of higher intelligence. So we become actually, we grow in the higher collective coherence. And now, I mean, we have seen in the past that sometimes that phenomenon is being directed or directs itself to a very beneficial cause. And sometimes the same phenomenon as you described has been willingly directed into another direction. And I think that what actually are the forces that allow that is very interesting to what voice speaks here in the field and what voice speaks here in the field when it becomes a very beneficial, healing, integrative process, or if it becomes a destructive process. And I think that's interesting. What is the dynamic of these two forces, or of the two examples that you brought? I think that's an interesting exploration. And the other one is also that we more and more train, and I think supported through the very technology that we are using now, or technology as such, is this kind of larger coherence or networks that actually on Mount Sinai, like when the collective revelation and God spoke to everybody, like to the whole Hebrew people, and everybody said, God spoke to me personally, to me, to my life. That's very interesting. It's not something abstract or general has been said. Something has been said that is deeply true for everybody in his or her life. And I find this very interesting. The individual healing, as you said, is also collective trauma work, is also embedded in the universal, and the most universal expresses itself through the most individual. And that entanglement is interesting in the field work. So what ignites these collective networks to be able to do this deeper collective work? I think all of these are elements of the very topic that we explore together right now. Yeah.
I'm recalling a theme in our 2012 conversation about working with collective trauma at scale. And at that time, there was no Zoom. So we were speaking about it as the size of the gathering. And I know I was especially interested because you were working with larger groups than I knew other practitioners to be doing, and doing so effectively. So returning to this theme of scale, so now our gatherings are on Zoom. Yesterday, I was in a gathering of 400 people on Zoom. The week prior, 1,000 people. And we are seeing that there is great potential here, and obviously constraints as well. There's something here, though, that artists have known about coherence in large gatherings, particularly musicians. Peter Gabriel, for example, comes to mind in particular. And so looking at, we just spoke briefly about how mystical understanding, scientific inquiry can converge on this topic and how we can bring it to bear in educating practitioners. Going towards the art side of this, your wife Yehudit is an artist, a professor of art, and also who has applied art to the topic of collective trauma. So we have this convergence of mystical understanding, scientific inquiry, and artistic practice, artistic endeavor, which can all come together in how we heal collective trauma and how we educate practitioners who work with collective trauma. You mentioned an event in a recent gathering between the East when you were working with the trauma of separation, Germany's separation into East and West. And something you mentioned a few weeks ago in our last conversation was how these bricks were brought into the room. And this seems to me what we could describe as an artistic intervention in the field. And this worked quite well. Where are the opportunities here to work artistically with collective trauma?
Yeah, the artistic. I think one thing that we didn't yet talk about so deeply is like the higher organizing principle of the system. What actually runs the system? What is the higher organ? What's the conductor? I call it often the conductor. That we all know as facilitators, we are the conductor helper. And that's very interesting because some facilitators might be tempted to play the conductor. And the conductor helper is actually very porous, very receptive. You know, the cross, the information can flow in all directions, up and down, from the future to the past, from the past to now, to the present, to the future, like outside, inside. And I believe like good facilitators and good artists that are not just creating illustrations of things, but are more connected to the expression that ends up in art pieces or in music or in installations or drawings or poetry. There is a kind of also like a streaming, and it's connected to that higher organizing principle. And anyway, I believe everybody who is appropriately connected to that higher organizing principle creates an art form in whatever discipline. So there is like the art is in the creative principle as such. And so I see often like artists in their artistic act, like there's something that comes through. It's not something that I manufacture by effort and I try hard. I mean, I might also be trying, but not by recombining the past. There's an element of a, and often I call it the the virgin birth is the act of the genius as a principle. The genius as a principle is like something is being created online and there's no planning. I'm not planning it. It's like it's an online streaming of the future or the creativity, the higher organizing principle into now. And then we are surprised. And then we bring in research to find out what that is. You know, and then we make theories about what actually happened. But I believe all the great geniuses in any field, the genius moment was an unpredictable moment. It's not a moment that we planned and then no, it's like, boom, here it is, the virgin birth, it's here, the child's here, where is the father? And kind of like this element of surprise. And I think many of us notice that we sometimes say things, or more and more often say things that are new, that are surprising to us. And I think many facilitators have that anyway, that during your work, you say many things that are surprisingly new and surprising yourself. And so I believe that element in when we bring in the artistry in many ways, and of course art as also ways to voice something that cannot be voiced with words, that cannot be voiced with with in other ways. So it needs that kind of artistic voicing, because it cannot be said or talked about in the regular way. So there are different levels. Either we stream that which is unvoiceable, or we stream the higher organizing principle. But the act is very similar. It's kind of there's a fluidity or a porousness that allows information to appear. And I believe that's a very, because we can't, it's not, once we come and say, how does it work? We actually prevent it. So there's something that forces us to stay in the unknown of the porousness. And it's not upon, I'm grateful for what I see, and I'm grateful for what stays hidden, because this is thy will. And that's why I'm here, because I'm already a creation. I'm already created, and I'm being created every moment again. So in honoring or bowing down to that principle, it's happening. So that's what we call presence. But if I want to, not bow down to that principle and try to figure out what it is, to be in control, then it's not. And I think that's very interesting about the artistic act, that it works like from that place. So that's what I find interesting. And I also feel, and also in the training of many facilitators, the ones that can become like enter that fluidity, and become the voice of the field, I think that's a very powerful, at least one very powerful element of very good facilitation, the conductor helper.
Whenever two or more are gathered in my name,
Right.
the great refrigerator in the sky opens.
Right.
And it is always full.
Right. Right.
So if we call this unknowable mystery God, we could say that when we are listening to each other, even now in this conversation, we are listening to each person, Thomas and Aftab, and then we're also listening to the voice of the field, or what could say, voice of God. Sometimes when people are uncomfortable with the term God, it can be useful to use the term creative imagination. So I'm listening to Thomas, and I'm listening to creative imagination. And then as Thomas and creative imagination intersect more and more, then it begins to feel like the voice of the field, where both Thomas and Aftab are speaking what they have thought before, but also what the field is thinking at this moment.
That's beautiful. Yeah, right.
So linking this capability and the essential significance of this capability for the individual practitioner, the conductor helper, and a collective field of collective trauma practitioners who do this better and better and become more and more capable of harvesting this capability in communities and cities. If we hold this aspiration, and if we are, for the next few months at least, but potentially for a year or even more, our gatherings may be just online. You've been doing some large online gatherings as well. What are we learning, and where are some emerging questions?
Yeah, what we are learning is that we first learn to embody the internet. I call it embodying the internet. Is like when I sit here with you and I consciously tune in with you, I feel your body through my body. I feel your emotions through my emotions. I'm following your mind and synchronized with your mind, synchronized with presence, the relational quality, the dance between us, and the whole field. So there is like a way to not see. In a way, it's interesting because you're sitting like thousands of miles away from where I'm sitting. And still we can have a pretty precise and accurate perception of one another. And even if we do it intentionally even deeper, then it gets even more refined. So it means that information doesn't seem to sit just in San Francisco or in Tel Aviv, but information is more intimate. I often call this the intimate internet. Like through attunement, we actually apply a mystical practice that many, like some of the saints expressed when they were sitting for a long time in meditation or spiritual practices, that feeling somebody on the other side of the planet is actually not that hard. And I think the very technology that we use right now is kind of a crutch that helps us to learn it. And so, and on the one hand, I think in order to do more collective work online, is that my mind might tell me at the beginning, oh, I see just an image of Aftab, oh, it's not so close, I would love to sit with you in a room. But actually, if I activate my whole embodiment and my whole nervous system and my whole capacities, I am actually much closer to you than I think, at least at first. So many people might think virtual spaces are more mental spaces, but if I practice it, they become very close spaces too, and very connected and warm and intimate and close. And then that's true for groups around the planet too. Because when we think about collective trauma, as I said at the beginning, many things are so normal. Distance. Is distance really distance, or is distance the accumulation of many inner trauma retractions and frozen areas that make the world look really big and complex? The world is big and complex, but is it that big, or is maybe in a more fluid and less fragmented world, we are all much closer to one another than we think? And so what is in the experience? Because when you see like somebody that touches a trauma, oftentimes it feels removed, disembodied, dissociated, all the things that we talked about. But if many of us walk around with this kind of interior distancing or retraction or aloneness, so then the world might be actually much bigger in our experience than it is in the current experience that's actually happening. And the question that I'm often asking, are we really going through a crisis? Or is the crisis a sleepwalking through the cavities of our trauma absence? Is there really something like a crisis? Or does crisis always ring the bell and say, humanity look like the plagues in Egypt in the Bible? Is it really that the plagues create the crisis? Or does it show us where information cannot flow in us, where we are absent, where we are hitting these black holes, but we are actually not stopping, saying, listen, what are all those symptoms? What is all this chaos, all this miscommunication? What is all this inability to take care of a pandemic? Is that really an inability? Do we not have the capabilities, or do we not have the right data flow through the human cloud system? And so the question is, if there is an actual crisis as the present experience, or if the crisis is, let's say, for the bigger part of it, to be friendly, for the bigger part of it, the internal experience that we have according to what's really happening right now. And I think that's worth an exploration. And so when we tune in with each other in virtual fields, let's say we are able to create that online intimacy as closeness, we are able to sense each other in intentional fields. So the intention, we are all connected, like it's a plug-in, like a tent. There's a spine to the group, and then we are all connecting and plugging in. So that creates a coherent field with the right ingredients. And then I believe we are definitely able to do amazing healing work and also amazing collective learning work through those fields. And I think that's really exciting, to speed up the computing power of humanity and Because there's often the question, oh, computers will outrun, the computing power will outrun. Yeah, with all these trauma patches, maybe yes. But the question is, what if we are really close? What if we really listened to the conductor? How would that orchestra play when we all listen to the conductor? Not many listen to their own conductor, to the conductor. And so this, I think these are all interesting questions for this topic.
Both the black hole and the great conductor, the great refrigerator, are non-local.
That's right.
And part of the mystery of the field is that it has this local and non-local dimensions, both. So returning then to where we started when we first began to speak about the difference in collective capability between Israel and the US when it comes to responding to the pandemic, immediate and urgent responses to the pandemic. Holding the intention of bringing together very large numbers, in the thousands, of collective trauma practitioners that collectively go to the next level of capability.
Beautiful.
Your book is coming out in a few months on healing collective trauma. Is it already finished? Are you able to continue shaping it as we move through the pandemic?
No, it's already finished. It's already with the publishing house and in the last process. So there's no potential changes to be made.
So the next chapter, the unwritten chapter, has begun, I imagine.
That's right.
And that when we talk, after the book is released, and when we talk, that can be the next chapters.
That's right. Beautiful. Yeah. Lovely.
And we'll bring this chapter to a close today. Thomas, it's been a real pleasure to
very lovely
to be in the field with you and let the field think.
Very much so, Aftab. For me too. That's lovely. And also lovely to share this space with you here in this one-on-one attunement. It was lovely. It's a really lovely exploration. And I'm very happy for further explorations.
Maybe we could call this conversation, when it's released, which we'll do within days, maybe we could call this conversation The Great Conductor and the Black Hole.
That's right. Fantastic. Let's do that.
Thank you again, Thomas.
Thanks for joining us. Integral Voices is produced by the Center for Transformative Learning at Meridian University. All episodes are available at meridianuniversity.edu/integral voices. For more information about Meridian, including upcoming public courses, other podcasts, and information sessions, visit meridianuniversity.edu. See you next time.